When one thinks of vampires, one might imagine a distinctly gothic scene, where pale creatures with a human semblance enjoy a luxurious nocturnal existence. Much of the modern mythos of vampires might well be considered more Byronic than vampiric. A sophisticated and even romantic facade, concealing a predatory ugliness. This contradiction is probably what drives much of the popularity of such mythical creatures, at least in the modern age. There are older myths, however, that are far more straightforward and grisly. Various creatures that tend to stalk the night as they drain the life from their unfortunate victims. Of course, these unsettling myths are not without their counterparts in reality. So let us take a closer look at some of the more unusual and unexpected vampires that may be found lurking in the natural world. There are many myths and legends that may be found in various human cultures. Among such stories, certain themes and motifs seem to appear with considerable regularity. One of these themes is vampirism. Though the details vary greatly, one can find tales of blood-drinking monsters the world over. One reason for this is likely linked with the concept of blood being a sort of tangible measure of vitality. The blood is the life, to quote Mr. Stoker. To truly understand this statement, one must briefly consider just what blood actually is. For the sake of simplicity, let us consider vertebrate blood alone. Blood is a unique type of tissue with the primary function of acting as a medium for moving various substances about the body. It is unique because, unlike other tissues, the extracellular matrix is normally liquid rather than solid or semi-solid. While blood is used to transport hormones, nutrients, and waste products in most organisms, it serves an additional function in typical vertebrates. That is, the carrying of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Because of this function in particular, a loss of blood beyond a certain point leads to a loss of oxygen supply to the body's tissues. This is perceived as an immediate loss of vitality, or life itself in a sense. There is also a more concrete loss of life involved in the loss of blood. After all, producing blood and replacing losses requires a certain amount of energy and raw material. So, loss of blood can be readily associated with at least a partial loss of one's life. The idea of a creature that extracts and consumes life via blood is a rather evocative concept. This could go quite a ways towards explaining its recurrence in mythology worldwide. There is at least one other reason beyond this, though it is perhaps not quite so dramatic. As it turns out, vampirism is rather common in nature. At the very least, there are not many parts of the globe that are lacking in biting flies. If a part of daily life is dealing with the noxious depredations of the local mosquitoes, it isn't at all difficult to envision some form of monster that siphons blood from hapless victims. There is a certain sense to the drinking of blood, or hematophagy to use a more scientific term. As blood is a tissue that carries nutrients about the body, it stands to reason that it must have at least some degree of nutritional value when consumed. Beyond this, it is a more than adequate source of water and protein, two substances that are quite vital to all forms of life. Thus, it is perhaps not so surprising to find so many different types of creature engaging in the theft of blood from unwilling and often unwitting hosts. Still, there are problems and challenges inherent to blood consumption. Perhaps the most obvious is the likely resistance of whatever creature the blood is being extracted from. Most hematophages are considerably smaller than their hosts, and this affords some degree of stealth to allow for unobserved feeding. Taking blood meals in the dark tends to help with such efforts at going unnoticed, so one often finds vampires to be active at night or around dawn or dusk. There is another advantage to the typical hematophage being smaller than its victim. Such a size disparity means that it is highly unlikely that a single blood meal will significantly weaken the host. This means that these parasites are able to return to feed on the same target on multiple occasions. Even if the host is unaware, there is still the issue of actually getting at the blood. This typically requires getting past some form of integument. Some vampiric species simply open a wound using sharpened teeth. A more common approach is the use of a feeding apparatus consisting of one or more hollow needles, capable of piercing the host's skin. Such stylets are connected to a rather robust internal pump to generate adequate negative pressure, allowing the blood to be efficiently extracted. Such systems alone are inadequate for proper vampirism because of the nature of vertebrate blood in particular. A rather significant problem for the would-be hematophage is the tendency of blood to clot. If such coagulations were to obstruct the feeding apparatus, the results would be nothing short of disastrous, at least for the parasite. To remedy this issue, most if not all hematophages produce substances that either inhibit blood clotting or dissolve clots away as they form. Such anticoagulants are most often produced in whatever salivary glands the hematophage might possess. Finally, there is a problem of nutrition. Blood may be quite rich in protein, but it is lacking in certain vitamins. Many hematophages obtain these missing nutrients from other substances in their diet. For those species that feed exclusively on blood, there are other methods of filling in these gaps. In lice, for example, the digestive tract contains symbiotic bacteria that produce and provide the missing vitamins in exchange for a place to live. As if missing nutrients weren't troublesome enough, there is the issue of excessive nutrients where blood is concerned. Vertebrate blood is rather rich in iron due to the hemoglobin found in red corpuscles. The blood contains far more iron than any creature typically requires for its own life processes. Iron atoms have a troublesome tendency to readily pick up and drop off electrons, so free iron floating about in the body tends to cause a fair bit of biochemical havoc. For this reason, in the human body at least, any iron is carefully bonded with various proteins to prevent such unregulated electron trading. Thus, for the hematophage, it is vital to get rid of the excess iron in the diet. Fortunately enough, blood also typically contains more water than the creature requires as well. Thus, the extra water serves as a perfect medium for getting rid of the extra iron. In other words, hematophages tend to expel a considerable amount of fluid from the posterior end of their digestive tract. Perhaps not the most glamorous solution to the problem, but certainly an effective one. Despite these challenges, one can find vampirism in a great variety of creatures. There are creatures that swim and slither, others that creep and scuttle, and quite a few that fly through the air. Aside from a handful of vertebrate species, the majority of hematophages are invertebrates. The most common overall pattern is a relatively small invertebrate quietly stealing blood from a larger vertebrate. Typically, the host is unaware of the feeding. If it is aware, the parasite must typically move rather quickly to escape an untimely demise. Unfortunately enough, there are also a wide variety of pathogens transmitted by these blood feeders. Depending upon the species, one may find viruses, rickettsia, bacteria, protozoa, or even tiny invertebrates being transmitted. This phenomenon is widespread and medically important, and the study is commonly known as vector biology. In this context, a vector is an organism that transmits a pathogen to another organism. Under this definition, a vector is not always a hematophage. It is quite possible, after all, to transmit a disease without taking a blood meal in the process. However, vampirism provides an almost ideal route for infection, and so the hematophage is the most common sort of vector. While there are a number of diseases transmitted in this way, and many are debilitating or disfiguring, or even deadly, I will not explore such maladies here. To begin with, the variety of vampires is more than enough to occupy our time for the moment. Also, quite frankly, the associated diseases are often rather depressing to consider. Perhaps it is a small conceit on my part, but I believe a look into nature's vampires should have a somewhat more sanguine tone. Due to the sheer variety of vampirism, I will refrain from covering the more obvious or famously known creatures for the time being. There's a great deal of very interesting biology to be found in creatures like mosquitoes, lice, and vampire bats. However, one may find similarly fascinating stories among the less familiar creatures. So, with these caveats and limitations in mind, let us take a look at a few of the little monsters that are out for blood. To begin with, let us consider an example of a flying vampire. Certainly, there are many examples both in myth and in nature. There are mosquitoes, horseflies, deerflies, biting midges, sandflies, blackflies, stable flies, and tsetse flies, to name a few. There are also vampire bats, of course. For today, though, I would look at vampirism from a more unexpected source: the vampire moths. Before going into the details of these unusual little hematophages, it might be wise to consider a few other moths first. Much like butterflies, typical moths feed upon nectar. It seems like quite the leap to switch from nectar feeding to blood feeding. However, a closer look reveals this might not be as far of a leap as one might think. One thing that nectar often lacks is dissolved ions known as electrolytes. Such electrolytes are vital for the proper function of nerves and muscles. To this end, a great many Lepidoptera imbibe fluids from sources rather different to flowers. It is not uncommon to see butterflies and moths feeding from puddles, or even piles of fresh dung. Perhaps this spoils their aesthetic a bit, but such is often the case when one looks more closely at living creatures. More ambitious moths are known to settle on vertebrates near the eyes, seeking to sip a few tears. This is generally not met with much enthusiasm from the animal in question, as a tiny proboscis poking about one's eyes tends to be rather irritating. Moths will also feed upon sweat in some cases, as this is also a good source of the essential salts. There are quite a few moths, particularly in the family Geometridae, that will opportunistically feed from open wounds. Thankfully, these species are unable to create wounds themselves, but they do collect a bit of blood and similarly salty seepage to meet their electrolyte needs. In certain parts of the world, such as Southeast Asia, there are a handful of species of rather more proactive moths. These moths are all in the genus Calyptra, and they have mouthparts that are capable of piercing the skin of vertebrate hosts. A close look at these mouthparts reveals a rather formidable array of minuscule spines. The bite is said to range from nearly painless to rather painful, perhaps in connection to how sensitive the particular patch of skin might be. As far as appearance, these moths tend to be brown in color. The front wings are subtly patterned, and their back edges are sinuously curved. This causes these moths to resemble dead leaves or scraps of bark while at rest, with their wings folded over their backs. One might wonder just how these moths became capable of piercing the skin of animals. The answer to this question may be found elsewhere in their diet. In addition to the occasional blood meal, these moths are known to pierce fruits and suck the juices from them. Apparently, the armaments that are required to pierce the skin of a fruit can be readily adapted to piercing the skin of more active targets. Interestingly enough, it is only the males of these moth species that apparently take blood meals. Both males and females subsist mainly upon the juices they obtain by piercing fruits. It is theorized that the males take these blood meals as a means of obtaining electrolytes and might pass some of these vital salts along to females during mating. Still, this is not clearly proven as yet. In any case, as it turns out, these moths are essentially frugivores with a side of vampirism. In other words, rather than vampire bats, these creatures might be more akin to fruit bats with just a little blood on the side. There are many cases of species that feed on blood as part of a more varied diet. One of the more interesting cases involves a sort of indirect vampirism. Around Lake Victoria in Africa, one can find a rather singular species of jumping spider. This species is known as Avarca culicivera, and is sometimes referred to as the vampire spider. This name may be just a little misleading, as these spiders do not jump on people to suck their blood. Still, the males of this species do look the part. They are black, glossy creatures with deep red faces and a few white spots. The females have a more drab brownish coloration, though they do tend to have a slightly reddish cast about them. What makes these particular vampires so unusual is the manner in which they obtain their blood meals. These spiders preferentially seek out and hunt female Anopheles mosquitoes that have recently taken a blood meal. The spider consumes the mosquito, and the stolen blood along with it. While there are many varieties of mite and tick known to feed on vertebrate blood, this is the only spider known to do so. Even then, it only really consumes blood as a sort of bonus component to its more typical meal of ill-fated insect prey. While the flying varieties of vampire are quite troublesome, the species that are lacking in wings are often at least as unpleasant. Between lice, fleas, and ticks, virtually everybody has had a disagreeable encounter with these many-legged bloodsuckers at some point or another. Still, there are a few somewhat more obscure arthropods that find their way into our dwellings with similarly undesirable results. One especially tenacious pest is known as the bedbug. These creatures have something of an interesting history, as they have been unwanted guests in human dwellings for centuries. Closely related species are sometimes found in caves associated with bats. It is theorized that the bedbug originally lived in these conditions as well. The population of this pernicious parasite was greatly reduced for a time during the early days of organochlorine pesticides such as DDT. However, with the removal of these pesticides due to environmental concerns, bedbugs have been making something of a comeback. I should probably note that even the cleanest of homes may become infested with these creatures, if any should happen to find their way into the dwelling. Alas, even the most fastidious of persons may fall prey to the depredations of these little menaces simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. For example, let us suppose that a person takes a trip. It might be for business, or a holiday, or perhaps a bit of both. It doesn't especially matter. Suppose that this unfortunate individual happens to stay in just the wrong hotel room. A room that just happens to have a few bedbugs lurking in its darker corners. During the course of the overnight stay, the bedbugs tend to wander about, and when morning comes, they find new places to hide. Places that might include the occupant's luggage. The flattened body of the bedbug makes it quite easy for them to hide away in even the narrowest of gaps. There is very little that troubles the little passengers during the return trip. They aren't especially bothered by either heat or cold unless it is prolonged and rather extreme. They are in no danger of starving, as adult bedbugs may survive for several months between blood meals. Sooner or later, the luggage finds its way back to the traveler's home. From there, the bedbugs spread out to occupy their newly annexed territory. Still, only a few bedbugs are likely to be carried in this way. Hardly a problem, one might suppose. Alas, if there is even a single pregnant female, that is enough to lead to a remarkable population explosion within a few months. Even if there is no such passenger, all that is required is at least one male bedbug and at least one female, and a bit of time. The bedbug mating process is rather unusual compared to that of most creatures. The female has a fairly standard reproductive tract for the laying of eggs, but it is not the route for fertilization. Instead, there is a decidedly more violent approach, known as traumatic insemination. The male's reproductive organ is rather sharply pointed and pierces the abdominal wall of the female. Details vary, but in the typical bedbug, the body is pierced in a relatively consistent spot on the underside of the abdomen. There is even a small groove in the ventral exoskeletal plate to more readily guide the process. Beneath the exoskeleton is a specialized organ that collects the sperm and transfers it to the storage chambers found in most insects. The small wound heals over readily enough, leaving a scar from each mating. Thus fertilized, the female bedbug goes about laying eggs at a slow, steady pace of a few every day. These eggs hatch into tiny nymphal bedbugs. These aren't quite as resilient as the adults, but they are far easier to overlook. From the beginning, these tiny insects are vampires. They are equipped with mouthparts that include a quartet of stylets, which work together to pierce the skin and extract a blood meal. The abdomen is capable of a considerable amount of stretching, allowing the bedbug to expand to several times its normal size as it feeds. Eventually, the bloated creature clambers off to quietly digest its stolen blood in a properly secluded locale. There is a tendency for bedbugs to take a series of blood meals from a single host in rapid succession while the host sleeps. It isn't uncommon to see clusters of bites quite close together as a result. 3 bites is not an uncommon number, but this is by no means universal. Still, it can aid in diagnosing bedbug infestations for the careful observer. Another sign for diagnosis has to do with an inevitable consequence of feeding. It is said what goes up must come down. One might also opine what goes in must come out, and come out it does quite soon after feeding. Blood is mostly water after all, and the bedbug has to rid itself of at least some of that excess water. It also rids itself of some of the excess iron, and so its droppings look rather similar to the blood that it imbibed, a dark reddish fluid. As bedbugs tend to feed on people while they are in bed, these droppings tend to accumulate in the bedding as distinctive dark reddish-brown spots. If you ever find yourself staying in a hotel room, it is wise to check the sheets for such spots. If you find any, I would strongly suggest that you leave immediately and warn the hotel staff of a probable infestation in that room. That is, unless you would prefer to carry a few unwanted passengers with you after an overnight stay. When the nymphal bedbugs have fed, the acquired nutrients are typically sufficient to cause a growth spurt. They will shed their skins, molting into the next nymphal instar. There are 5 such stages before a final molt into adulthood. The adult looks rather like the nymph. Neither of these has functional wings. Even in adults, there are only a couple of vestigial wing pads on the thorax. The shed skins that are left behind by this process can sometimes be found in out-of-the-way places, and serve as another sign of an active infestation. An easy place to check for in hotel rooms is behind the headboard of the bed, though such exuviae can be found in all sorts of secluded little corners. It would not surprise me if a fair number of listeners are itching by this point, just at the thought of such charming house guests. Indeed, most people find the bedbug bites to be quite itchy and uncomfortable. However, there are some who have almost no reaction to them whatsoever. The amount of blood taken tends to be far too small to cause any health problems, so the irritation of bites is virtually the only issue. Unlike a great many hematophages, bedbugs are not known to carry any diseases. This is perhaps a small mercy, considering how difficult it can be to remove an infestation. Somewhat interestingly, the genetic material in the blood taken by bedbugs tends to remain intact for quite some time after feeding. Thus, with sufficiently sophisticated tools, it is possible to conduct a genetic analysis to see just what, or rather who, a bedbug might have been dining upon. This has a degree of forensic potential, at least in certain cases. It is easy enough for a person to imagine something like an insect or an arachnid that is specialized in vampirism. Alongside the bedbugs, there are innumerable mites and ticks that feed on blood, to say nothing of the many varieties of biting fly. However, there is another group of arthropods worth considering, and that is the crustaceans. One might not readily envision something like a shrimp or a lobster taking a blood meal. Lowbrow comedy aside, one wouldn't expect a crab to do so either. However, there is one rather interesting little crustacean that has specialized as an ectoparasite of fish. Though it is perhaps something of a misnomer, these creatures are commonly known as fish lice, and they are in the genus Argulus. Perhaps befitting its aquatic habitat, the Argulus is a streamlined little creature, flattened with a smooth back and several swimming appendages on its underside. In front of these appendages lies a pair of tiny suction cups the creature uses to adhere to the skin of its host. The Argulus is equipped with a set of piercing mouthparts, much like those of many other vampires. Tiny, hollow needles, perfect for extracting blood through the skin. Despite their relatively harmless appearance, these little crustaceans are potentially quite harmful to fish. especially those populations that are commercially reared in fisheries. An outbreak of fish lice can lead to illness and weakness and eventually death on a worrying scale. Such is often the case with many parasites. As enjoyable as it is, considering the many-legged hematophages, and inducing uncomfortable itching sensations in those who may be listening, I believe it is time to move on to other blood drinkers for the time being. Perhaps, instead of those with many legs, we might instead consider those with no legs whatsoever. It is interesting to note how certain patterns seem to keep reasserting themselves in the natural world. Among these patterns are types of body structures that appear quite similar in very different lineages. One of the most common forms in the animal kingdom is the worm. It is so ubiquitous, there is a technical name for animals that take on such a shape. Such creatures are said to be vermiform. When one thinks of a worm, one of the likely images to spring to mind is an earthworm burrowing through the soil. These particular creatures are part of the phylum Annelida, generally known as segmented worms. Their bodies appear segmented on the outside, and their internal structures share a similar segmentation. This relatively simple and straightforward body structure is remarkably successful, and the annelids can be found in myriad environments, occupying diverse ecological niches. Perhaps it is not too surprising, then, that with such diversity, at least some members of this phylum would take to vampirism. Such hematophagus worms can be found within the subclass Hierodynia, commonly known as the leeches. While most people have at least a passing familiarity with the leeches, this group is filled with little surprises. To begin with, only some of the species within this group are actually vampires. The majority are either scavengers or predators. One might ask just how a legless, soft-bodied worm could possibly be an effective predator. The answer is with surprising efficacy. One need only look up carnivorous leeches to gain some insights into these little monsters. Today, however, we are focusing upon the hematophages. So let us consider a couple of examples of vampire leeches. The first, and most famous, would be the medicinal leech, Hierodo medicinalis. In fact, recent studies have shown this one species to be at least 3 distinct species, but for the sake of simplicity, I will hold to the old classification here. A cursory glance at this particular variety of leech will show a limbless little worm with a dark hue and a body coated in glossy slime. A somewhat closer look reveals a surprisingly intricate pattern of orange, green, and yellow markings across its body. It is the sort of patterning one might expect to see adorning an expensive Persian rug, albeit on a more modest scale. This slimy little creature gained its name through the old practice of bloodletting. While this has largely fallen out of favor, the medicinal leech has been put to use in connection with certain modern medical procedures. Sometimes, generally through unfortunate accidents, a person may have a part of their body severed. Perhaps a finger or a hand cut or torn away by some mishap or another. Thankfully, it is sometimes possible to reattach these lost body parts with varying degrees of success. Still, such procedures are not without their challenges. One of these challenges involves the circulation of blood. The arteries supplying blood to the reattached tissues are easy enough to repair. They are relatively few in number and tend to appear in rather consistent locations. They also have thick vessel walls that are readily stitched together with the proper surgical techniques. Veins are rather different. Their walls are comparatively thin, and they tend to be more abundant and more variable in their placement. Thus, they are far more difficult to completely reconnect. The effect of this is a steady supply of blood entering the reattached body part, but only a partially successful drainage of this blood through the partially reconnected veins. If this blood is permitted to accumulate for too long, the tissue will die. This is where the medicinal leech has proven highly useful. Allowing a leech to feed on the reattached tissues removes the excess blood. In addition, the anticoagulants in the saliva prevent unwanted blood clots from forming. This allows time for the veins to properly repair themselves. re-establishing the remaining connections as the tissue heals. It is worth noting that the anticoagulants produced by the medicinal leech have been studied, duplicated, and modified to produce a series of medications. One substance especially well studied is hirudin, a peptide found in the saliva of the medicinal leech. It is merely one out of a number of components, however. The effects of these various substances include anticoagulant and anesthetic effects, but this is only the beginning. It would appear that some of these chemicals have antimicrobial functions, while others function as anti-inflammatory chemicals. Still others may even have inhibitory effects on cancer growth and metastasis. It would be presumptuous to declare this little worm to be a panacea, but it is accurate enough to say that its study has given rise to a number of promising novel medicines. In spite of all of this utility, we must remember that the medicinal leech is a guest in the hospital. It did not evolve in such a place. It was not engineered in a laboratory. No, it is a creature native to the wild, and it is worth considering how it lives without human associations. This species, like many leeches, is essentially aquatic, or at the very least amphibious. It is able to swim when necessary by undulating its body, though it is also quite capable of creeping through secluded spaces underwater. Its locomotion is aided by a pair of suckers on its body. One is located at the front and surrounds the mouth, while the other is located at the back. Thus, it is possible for such a leech to move in a manner not unlike that of an inchworm. It may grip a surface using its posterior sucker, extend its body forward, adhere to the surface with its anterior sucker, and then release the hold of its posterior sucker and finally pull its body forward. A repetition of these steps allows a slow but steady movement across a surface. These suckers are not only useful for movement, but they are also vital for feeding. They are the principal means of clinging to a host while the leech extracts a blood meal, after all. The feeding mechanism is straightforward enough, though there are some rather unique details. Rather than a hypodermic needle, the medicinal leech employs a trio of serrated teeth to open a small wound into the skin. This wound has a very distinct shape, with 3 straight lines converging onto a single point. The bite is typically not noticed due to the anesthetic properties of the leech saliva. The anticoagulant properties prevent the wound from closing too rapidly, allowing time for the creature to properly feed. The feeding is accomplished by means of an internal pump just behind the mouth. The digestive tract here has several dense bundles of muscle connecting it to the surrounding body wall. When these muscles contract, the gut is pulled outward, expanding to all sides, generating the suction required to imbibe a bit of blood. From there, simple peristalsis conducts the fluid farther along into the digestive system. As with most hematophages, the medicinal leech is capable of expanding its body considerably to accommodate the acquisition of a rather large blood meal. When the creature is filled to capacity, it typically needs only to let go of its host, falling unnoticed back into the water. As is often the case with blood feeders, it may survive for several months without requiring another meal. There are a number of other leech species with varied behaviors and habitats. Among these are the land leeches, which often live in tropical forests and other similarly moist environments. The vampires among these species have an interesting behavior connected to their feeding. Such a leech will sometimes wait on a forest trail, adhering to the ground with its posterior sucker. It will then raise its body up into a roughly vertical position, with its anterior sucker at the ready to meet any passers-by. If a suitable host steps close enough, the leech bends rapidly towards it and takes hold with its anterior sucker. Provided the host doesn't notice its presence, the creature makes its incisions and begins quietly extracting a blood meal. Once sated, it drops off, and the host is none the wiser. At least until it notices a distinctive little wound on its leg that takes entirely too long to properly scab over. As unsettling as such an encounter might be, there are other varieties of leech that are nothing short of horrific. Before considering one species in particular, I should explain an interesting dichotomy in the leech feeding mechanisms. Some species employ the triad of cutting jaws seen in the medicinal leech, or a pair of jaws that function in essentially the same manner. Broadly speaking, this part of the leech family is known as the order Aerincobdelida. This rather convoluted name, roughly translated, means the leeches without snouts. This is in contrast to the Rhynchobdelida, or the leeches with snouts. This order is commonly known as the jawless leeches. Instead of the common trio of cutting teeth, these leeches possess a slender proboscis that pierces the skin of a host to draw out a blood meal. The largest species in this order, and the largest species of leech currently known, is the giant Amazon leech, Hementaria gillianii. This particular creature grows to nearly half a meter in length, and has a proboscis that can be extended several centimeters into the host tissues. This somewhat famous leech is known to produce an anticoagulant of sorts known as hementin. Unlike hirudin, which prevents clots from forming, hementin rapidly dissolves blood clots. It is secreted into the narrow proboscis to prevent it from becoming clogged as the creature feeds. Like many of the jawless leeches, this aquatic horror mainly feeds upon fish. This is perhaps fortunate for humans, though it is decidedly less fortunate for the fish. Despite the variety of creatures covered today, we have seen only a fraction of what is actually lurking out in the shadows. These vampiric species are generally disturbing and sometimes quite dangerous. However, it is important to keep a few simple truths in mind. First of all, they are not without their place and purpose in the world. The medicinal benefits of leeches alone counterbalance a fair amount of the damage done by the various vampires. Other species have proven quite useful as research subjects. An example would be the kissing bug, a cousin of the bedbug that was used in early experiments to elucidate several aspects of insect endocrinology. Even setting aside any human benefits, these sometimes malevolent little monsters are in the end just creatures trying to survive. They deal with the same basic challenges that face any living thing. The ways they have developed to answer those challenges are perhaps distasteful to us, but they are certainly effective. So, as a final brief tale, I will speak for a moment concerning the vampire bat. I need not go into detail regarding how this creature locates its prey, uses its specialized teeth to open small wounds, and laps up the resulting blood flow. There is little reason to dwell upon the anticoagulant and anesthetic properties of its saliva, as such phenomena have already been noted in other vampire species. One thing that is worth noting is how the vampire bats behave towards one another. Every night, these bats take to the air in search of a blood meal. Every day, they return to whatever communal roost they inhabit. As stealing blood from creatures many times your size is a risky and often dangerous endeavor, no bat is successful at obtaining a meal every night. This is a problem, since unlike most of the hematophages, the vampire bat is a warm-blooded creature with fairly high energy requirements. Even with the reduced metabolic rate of their daily sleep, even one night without a blood meal may be sufficient to lead to eventual death by starvation. Thus, the unsuccessful bats in the roost will beg their more successful neighbors for a share of their night's feeding. Remarkably enough, the well-fed bats oblige, regurgitating a portion of their meal for their unfortunate associates to imbibe. Such altruism is, in the end, vital to the survival of the colony. Tonight's successful vampire bat may be tomorrow night's hapless, starving wretch. The bat that shares its meal today may easily be begging for food tomorrow. If it were not for such behaviors, the colony would likely starve to death a few bats at a time. Even if this kindness is entirely pragmatic, it is still at least somewhat endearing in its way. If even a blood-sucking creature of the night can look after its fellows, it allows for some hope that humans may do the same. Still, in the end, the various hematophages are no more good than they are evil. If they have any morality at all, it is likely quite alien to our own human sensibilities. With this in mind, I shall end with a quote from Don Marquis, as typed out by a fictional cockroach he created. Insects have their own view about civilization. A man thinks he amounts to a great deal, but to a flea or a mosquito, a human being is merely something good to eat. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have enjoyed today's little foray into the unknown. If you are still curious and wish to venture a little further, here are a few things you might consider looking into. If you found this video enjoyable, do feel free to leave a like. If you believe others might enjoy it, by all means, share. If you wish to see more of this channel, a subscription should prove quite helpful. Before we end this, there are two small matters to address. First of all, thank you to everybody who has supported this channel. October is quite possibly my favorite month to begin with, and this particular October has been more memorable than most. So thank you for every subscription, every comment, every like, and every view. The channel has grown beyond all of my expectations, and I can only hope for this to continue moving forward. Which brings me to the second matter. As we move into November, I will be returning to the somewhat less frantic schedule of posting one video per week every Monday. Though it has been fun going the extra mile over the past month, I simply do not have the time or energy to maintain such a pace indefinitely. With that said, I might try and throw in the occasional extra video once in a great while. Even at this somewhat more sustainable pace, I hope you all enjoy my future content, and I look forward to seeing how things unfold over the next few months. So once more, thank you all. Until next time.